In this video, we'll be looking at budgetary supply-side policies, not only how they can be used theoretically, but how budgetary supply-side policies have been utilised in the last two budgets. So first of all, just a couple of key definitions, and these are really important, sort of 5 really key definitions for Chapter 14. First one, aggregate supply. Aggregate supply refers to or represents the total volume of goods and services that suppliers are willing and able to produce. Try and use those terms, willing and able to produce. Productive capacity, the maximum amount of output achievable for an economy at a particular point in time when all our land, labour and capital resources are used to their full potential. So make sure you talk about what the resources are and mention that it's all about maximising our use of resources to their full potential. Productivity, don't just define it as the amount of output per unit of input. It's a little bit too brief. Say that it's basically the amount of output per unit of input, which refers to how efficiently land, labour and capital resources are being transformed into goods and services. So you need to have some basis, so it has to be a measure of something against something else, or output per unit of input, and that can be like if you're making robots, it's the amount of robots per labour hour would be labour productivity, and the amount of robots per machine hour would be capital productivity. But output per unit of input, how efficiently land, labour and capital resources are converted into goods and services. Aggregate supply side policies is basically any government initiative. They have to be government initiatives. It's nothing to do with just businesses restructuring. Designed to reduce costs of production and improve supply side conditions for businesses by improving their quality or quantity of resources. And an efficient allocation of resources is one where resources are allocated in a way to maximise living standards or welfare at the lowest possible opportunity cost. It's really important you put that last bit in. Or if you're asked to refer to how an efficient allocation of resources relates to opportunity cost, it's about minimising opportunity cost. So there are a whole range of aggregate supply side policies. In this video we're going to be looking at budgetary supply side policies, and then over the next 3 videos we'll look at what's meant by each of these other forms of supply side policy. As I said, when you're referring to these policies, we're looking at ways we can boost real GDP by focusing on the 3 Ps: population, participation and productivity. Participation, again, it's been a while, but basically measuring the percentage of people over 15 that are actively seeking work or involved in the labour force. So budgetary policy is generally a demand policy. It's generally focusing on boosting aggregate demand, but it can be used to boost productive capacity and it can be used to influence the supply side of the economy. So if an economy is experiencing capacity constraints or an ageing population, there are ways that the policy can be used to try and boost participation or productivity and increase our long-term growth rates. So the initiatives are generally to increase the labour force participation rate, or assess skill shortages, or boost infrastructure to get rid of bottlenecks and capacity constraints. So here's some examples of supply-side policies that can be utilised. So we've got infrastructure spending, which we've talked about. Depreciation allowances, so that's about so businesses can claim more in tax when they purchase products or purchase machinery, which encourages them to do so and then become more productive. Reducing company and income taxes to promote participation and investment. Childcare subsidies, people to get back to work. Cutting red tape, if you see that term, it's basically a way to try and reduce businesses' compliance costs. So trying to get them to fill out less paperwork, making it easier to fill out all your GST requirements. That's an example of a supply side policy because it's reducing firms' costs of production. Providing loans for people that are affected by droughts to try and make it easier for them to invest and rebuild. Paid parental leave is about getting people back into the workforce. Export development grants are things like subsidies to try and reduce businesses' costs of production in export-related industries. So again, they can help penetrate world markets. So here's a list of basically just a couple of policies for each one. So you see things for productivity could include skilled migration. That could also go into participation. Infrastructure spending. Business tax concessions, so they'll invest in capital and machinery. The National Broadband Network, that's all based around trying to give everyone access to the internet. So that will help to increase the pace of internet activity. It'll make it easier for people to communicate with one another, so that it makes it cheaper for businesses because they don't need to, relocate. They can coordinate activities and meetings via Skype, so that saves them a lot of money as well. Participation, childcare rebates, cuts in personal income tax, increasing the pension age. Population, giving people money to have babies, increasing the migration intake, or introducing paid parental leave so people don't have to worry about the financial costs as much of having a baby. When you are referring to these 3 Ps, this is the kind of logic you need to be using, or the kind of language you need to be using. So if it's increasing productivity growth, it's all about trying to reduce average costs for businesses and therefore they have lower cost per unit of output, and that makes them more willing to produce. That's really related to the willingness and the ability of businesses to produce, but with lower prices, they will be more willing to supply. Higher rates of labour force participation is about trying to boost competition, reduce wage pressures, which will make businesses more willing to supply because their production costs are down, getting rid of labour shortages or skill shortages, and making sure that you're limiting those capacity constraints in the economy by supplying more and therefore having more access to resources. And a higher population will eventually flow into a higher labour force and protect us against an ageing population by minimising labour shortages. So some policies from this year's budget, I'm going to talk about these a little bit more in the next video.